So, hold on. So, I meant to do this thing in a kind of in the paste, So I'm doing all this stuff, and then things kind of came in, and then I had to kind of like get through those things, and not that those things are burdens, in fact, they're not. Um, I was just going at such a pace that, it just this blockage. I almost had to like just stop, just stop trying to force things and just kind of let things play kind of out naturally. So when those things kind of subside, we can kind of look toward, you know, and in this frame, I really wasn't like I had the whole thing, kind of set up, and then but we're here now. Porno sexuality. Um, so one of the things that's kind of fascinating about this whole topic, especially in terms of how we use it. So I'll reiterate what in the preview. I kind of wanted to focus in on the definitions of pornosexuality, on the textbook definition, and then how things are just gonna be used, right? Which is pretty much words, if not within. It's gonna get to that, especially with popular that have like compound ideas attached to it. So the textbook definition of pornosexuality is simply just a having a a primary, primary preference, or just a sole preference to use sexual depiction as opposed to having sexual relations. Um, Now, I want to even explore that aspect of it, but then there is the second definition, which is by and large how it's used. And that's where you have all these different kind of facets and all these different kind of cultural sort of ways. So like you have the so one of the biggest issues with this whole project is how to organize this whole thing. And I actually wrote down a way to organize it, and I kind of wanted to just make it as simple as possible for me to kind of get, because when it comes to the mini usage of it, it has all these different kind of ways. Like I don't have like a lot of this requires a bit of like how did it happen, how did it get started, and how did it kind of get into in the weird. One of the weird things about looking this up is that there really wasn't a clear cut sort of I couldn't find that much of an origin of it. Um, the way that this whole thing is packaged is where it's coming from. So I imagine it started from textbook, because like when I was going into the textbook, and you go into psychology today is both a very frustrating online media it's a very frustrating thing. I don't think psychology today is the best. Um, it is. I think because people treat it like, you know, you have all these different, whether from, I imagine many of them are professionals in some kind of field of psychology or just sociology, and they write articles. I kind of really want to. It's hard to hone in on what exactly psychology today is really about. I mean, you're gonna have all these varying different. Yeah, I'm veering off because I'm kind of trying to understand it. I'm assuming that because I would read something like stuff about like how in the overall concern of pornographic media, being fed through the internet, that there is a large usage of it, and to the point where people are seeming to prefer it. And again, there's a whole conversation like going into research. I started to remember like things that were going on. There was a shortage in terms of shortage, but people were actually engaging in sex a lot less. And I think this stuff is still going on where people are not having sex as much, but there is a lot of consumption of pornography. And so you had words like solo sexuality, which is having a sole preference for masturbation, or at least a large primary, you know, um, usage of sexual depiction opposed to having sexual relationships. You have things like pornosexuality, which is mostly focused on the media. Um, and so, like, you would go and have, you would, like, this stuff is a combination, and there's so many things that goes into this. So, you have a concern aspect about porn as opposed to people having sex. And again, a lot of this stuff is still sort of trying to be understood. Let's be honest, there's a lot of places in the world that have these sort of dry spells, and they're not this it's just with there's this use of media. I mean, just because people are not having sex doesn't mean they're not interested in sex, and so they're going to get their kicks somewhere. And so there's just this large, like, cultural concern. And I don't even know how much of a concern it is. Like, there is going to be people who are concerned about it, people who know the numbers, or at least are going to interpret the data. What the fuck's on this camera? Hold on. You go into all this kind of approaches to the data, and the this is where you get media outlet. This is why psychology today, I think people look at psychology and they just these are largely opinion pieces about how mostly focused on their psychology, but a lot of it is sociology, and some of the stuff gets conflated, like, and some of the stuff in psychology today isn't really. We should do a video. I should do something with. I should learn more about it's one of those websites that, unfortunately, it gets a lot. It's like Rotten Tomatoes. It's one of those things where, unfortunately, the outlet's credibility is over. Like, you'll come across an article like there's a lot of hit tilters and stuff, and again, it's really take psychology as more of like a bunch of opinion pieces from a psychology standpoint, from a sociology standpoint, sure, but you know, it's just they're not. So much of that requires a lot of research, and people are going to put out their opinions. Psychologists or people like would put out their opinions that are not they're not well researched. They're just interpretations of things. They're no different than a lot of outlets, and but and the reason I'm bringing this up because there's a lot of interpretive there's a damage. Well, there's a lot of interpretation of data, and things get muddled. I mean, there's so many things about, like, you go from something like inceldom starting off as actually, someone making a blog, to people honing in on it, and then it gets into its own sort of creation, held different, a whole different gender, in fact. And then eventually it's, we understand it to be a, a people that believe in specific things. Now it's just like, okay, people who don't get laid. It's been muddled, and now I'm afraid, like, words scare me. You go, and I think what's really frustrating is that you actually kind of are there in its development, and then it becomes something else, and it's like almost unrecognizable. So, and again, most people still understand these things, but things get conflated, things get, but there's a lot of beauty in it. such as pornosexuality. And pornosexuality is a product of this very thing. You go from people in having this very objective definition of it, um, and then it gets tossed into all these different categories. Now, one of the things, and this goes into a bigger point about pornosexuality, is that there's an operation of where we're kind of at when it comes to the usage of not only just a word, but just what we're doing with it. And I'd call this that difference in that coin, liberation versus something like subjugation, or even we'll say custody. So liberation and custody. And when we're exploring these two things, there's a lot of things we're conflating. Now, is the usage, so the individual who uses it or entertains pornosexuality, is it from the point of liberation, or is it something negative? Is there a kind of issue going on in the usage of it? Now, in going through this, I kind of wanted to categorize some of this, so I'll just kind of read it out. And some of these things have the same definition. So, oddly enough, the first thing that really kind of comes to mind is this idea of porn addiction, which again isn't recognized in the field of as a scientific sort of issue, or at least a sociology issue, or a psychology, but a sociology kind of thing too. Um, is porn addiction have a legitimate case? One, does it actually exist? Is this something where, now look, I already kind of put my opinion out there about my feelings toward the conceit of porn addiction. Sex addiction in itself is still kind of a controversial thing. We start off with something that is automatically there. Um, Sexuality is automotive, and your sensibilities are a little, they get kind of numbed. Your sensibilities are a bit numbed, um, and you're willing to do a lot more when you're sexually aroused. Then you have the whole. There is a lot of predictors when it comes to people who claim to have a porn addiction. Now, because we're talking about something that's very broad, I'm saying, like, if I say something like, porn addiction is largely probably just kind of a myth. If there's such a thing, it's either incredibly rare to get, if at all. Uh, Weirdly, I don't see why there would be a reason why, in all the research that seems to have gone in, and not a bunch, but enough, a pretty good amount of research have gone into porn addiction from a scientific, from in the scientific field. It is still not considered a legitimate thing, but there is people who do feel that they have an addiction. Doesn't mean you do, it just means you feel you do. And again, there has gotten to a point where we have the common clay, most people who, much like the general conceit of pornography, or at least not even pornography, but just the adult industry, which aren't really the same thing. You have something that's just like a um, a genre direction when it comes to photography and video sort of stuff, whatever kind of media. And then you have the capital kind of expression, whether people are putting out their business through the media and it becoming a whole business, like the sex. There literally is like the adult industry, and then there's the sex industry. The sex industry is like HBO's Real Sex, where we're talking about all these different facets of the sex industry. And then you have the adult industry, which is really a place in LA and like Nevada, and it's like a very specific thing, right? But all this stuff gets conflated within the porn industry. Like it gets conflated and it hones into pornography. The same could be said when it comes to shit like this. When it comes to the whole, like, people will sort of just start conflating stuff, and they'll just kind of accept it. So there really isn't going to be a social argument of it. Like, even though the stuff is out there, much like I've talked about this, the fact that there doesn't seem to be any actual alpha wolves. What we seem to be seeing is parent wolves, but you can lead in with a bias. So, like, people who believe that there are alpha wolves, they'll go into it thinking what they're seeing is alpha wolves. You're going to go into it thinking that what you're experiencing or what you're seeing is porn addiction. But you're seeing things like habituation. You're seeing things like and by the way, just because you're habituated doesn't mean that you have less of a sex drive. Much like hunger, if you're eating the same thing constantly, you're gonna kind of move on. And again, there's a whole idea that as you go on in this addiction, that you go to more extreme stuff. When there's no such thing as extreme things. Extreme is not even a real thing. There's no inherent extreme thing. They're extreme to you or different for you. Remember, when you're sexually aroused, your sensibilities are a bit, we'll say, numbed. They become less valuable, right? Like, remember those moments, especially during puberty, where you get sexual aroused and you do shit that you wouldn't normally do. The things you would do now, where you get sexually aroused, that is something that like you have a whole thing that's trying to get you to you know we'll say copulate. We'll say try to, I'm not going to say pass on genes necessarily. That's sort of the macro result of things. But in the micro processes, there's a lot, much like you're just like hunger, just like you're hot. You want to get, into a place where you're not so hot. You're thirsty. You're starving, right? Sexuality kind of plays in that same way, but because we have such a weird, crazy kind of weird, very, very historically based relationship with sexuality, with sex, and just as a phenomenon, as a natural phenomenon for especially mammals such as ourselves. Unfortunately, we have all these things where it's like we have these compound ideas about, like, a compound idea that doesn't really inherently exist, but it's something that we've definitely made seem very real. It's something like morality. Is morality a real thing? Morality can be something you can call something, but I don't know why you would need it. I mean, morality isn't as real as people think it is. It's not an actual thing. I mean, can you picture 700 people in the field ready to do some very, very terrible things to a couple of people because of a claim that they did something wrong, and you got the rope and you got all, like, there's a lot of capital punishment stuff with people. Like, are they all just evil people, or are they just people, right? Think big picture. Like, maybe these are very, very we'll say quick ways to identify stuff. I mean, what I said about swooping stuff. We take things in swoops. We don't like complicated things. We try to simplify. As we are creatures of convenience, we try to simplify everything. So instead of trying to understand our own sexuality, and the fact that sexuality inherently would be amoral. You have a sexual interest in something, so you're going to go about those things. And instead of trying to learn all these different things, whether those things are in the illegal or things are super tame or whatever, and understand them, and so we can better figure out how to approach those things. Porn addiction. Bad person. Good person, right? We don't try to understand what these things are. Our misunderstanding of sexuality is why we have something like porn addiction. It's a consequence of us not actually doing the work and actually trying to understand that stuff. So you get things like this. Now, on the one hand, it's a very negative thing that leads to a lot of issues. People out there believe that they have a porn addiction. And if there is such a thing, it's not those numbers. And we should hone it down. And if to actually understand if it actually exists. And if it does, it seems to be something rare. And I think in that case, it should remain rare. It's not. It, now, one of the things, and a kind of a weird benefit about beliefs, is that they're strong. They can be used, as I said, cruelty and kindness are mutually fruitful. We know historically there are plenty of benefits to being cruel to others, to ourselves, and there's something freeing about losing in the game of success, the game of gaining some kind of prestige for your own sake or for others. And then the opposite could be very liberating, right? There's something liberating about dropping off. One, because it sort of releases this thing. One, I think it's like, it's that thing where you're fearing something, and so it's like the very essence of just releasing the thing can be very liberating. You can go into it and try to understand why. Like, why does it feel liberating to just lose, right? I think it's just something very micro. It's the you drop something. There's something in something. It might be, especially if it leans towards something. So like it can be very liberating for some reason to lose. And so it's better for me to just bump up that feeling. The same thing for sexuality. Losing can feel very liberating. And so something like porn addiction could feel really liberating. Now, there's a huge can of worms when it comes to what that even means. Now, on the one hand, porn addiction or the idea of being addicted to something can feel really liberating. One, if you give in to the addiction, you have the thing, right? So if you have a bunch of people who believe that what they're experiencing is an addiction, it can be very relieving to, instead of trying to fight against this thing, to just sort of give into it. And again, it's sexuality, it's automotive, it's something that's already naturally happening. You're already going to feel sexually aroused by something, so you might as well give into it. Porn addiction kind of plays as a liberating aspect, but also a kind of a dependence, a negative thing, if you will. Also, subjugation, weirdly in itself, can be a liberating thing. This is why there's such facets in it. See what I mean? There's so much facets to this whole thing of porno sexuality as a there's all these different arenas, and we are just within the whole porn addiction aspect of it. Um, I think one of the things that's really kind of interesting when it comes to the liberation stuff. So let's focus on liberation. What is liberating about porn addiction? Again, acknowledging that it probably doesn't actually exist, but could exist. And again, if people believe in it, beliefs are powerful. If people believe in it, it might as well. It can exist within a particular context. So let's say as this existing phenomenon, which at least is the phenomenon happening, as far as there being a belief about it, there's something subversive. The subversiveness can be very liberating, right? They tell you not to be addicted to porn. You don't want to do that. And giving in to something that feels good can be very liberating. And I think it's even exasperates it. It exasperates it from the fact that it's something that it feels good, right? They're telling you to not do something that inherently feels good to do, right? There's so much that goes into the whole porn addiction thing, and I don't even really so much want to get it. Something I'll get back to. These are going to be circular. There's a lot of circular kind of things with it. But so in the liberating aspect of it, it's subversive because it's a good. It's an arousing feeling, right? We're talking about sex here. Um, Getting sexual gratification from media and naturally, you know, arousing feeling. And so the idea that you've kind of given into it, there's something liberating, right? When you say, you know what, I'm not gonna fight anymore. I'm just gonna give in to it. I'm gonna keep enjoying my media, right? And so there's that thing, and then there's the other side, what I call the custody aspect of it, which is more of a kind of an uphill battle, right? There's something weirdly, they're both gratifying. Oddly enough, there's the liberation aspect of it, which you have a group who like the idea of being addicted to porn because it's a great feeling, and I have so much of it. There's so much out there I can just indulge in. And you can say, look, I'm a porn addict and whatever. I'm going to embrace it. I don't care. Right? Um, and then you have this other group. And the other group, it's an uphill battle. You're constantly fighting this. Unfortunately, I mean, given that there seems to be a clear belief in it, but there really isn't a lot of evidence that's actually happening. Now, I'm gonna put that aside. Now that's I think it's relevant in perspective, but let's just go ahead and say that they have this addiction. It's an uphill battle, right? And you're just constantly failing. You're failing against something that's automotive. Again, sexuality is something that's linked in the way that hunger is. So how the hell do you defeat that? Now, one of the things that porn actually is convenience, right? Let's say you have, and I've used this metaphor before, let's say you have everything you'd ever want in your fridge. In your fridge, you have the best hamburgers, you have the best hot dogs, you have everything you'd ever want in this fridge. It's convenient, right? Now, in going out and having a sexual relationship, going and being able to see and visually get all the stimuli or whatever, in this case, feeding yourself, you'd have to go through all these linked and all these different avenues. Now your brain, again, you're a creature of convenience, so your brain wants to do the convenient thing. No, let's just go in the fridge and get the thing because it's there, right? You're fighting against all these different elements. And the weird thing about um, sociology is there's things in sociology when we make these cults or culture, which are the same thing. There's all these sort of like there's something that people have against something feeling good, or there's a tendency, and I think that tendency comes from you. The society wants you to. The channels, the game seems to be in the linear fashion, like you know. The cult of work for your food, work for your land, work for your roof, work toward your social sort of things, right? And speaking of which, I don't really want to get into this point necessarily, but I want to scrape on it, and then we'll get to this point because again, there's a lot of this that circles each other, so exasperates this. So there's a built-in belief that, and again, there's validity to it, but we'll have this poignant kind of way. So it's simple, but like I said, creatures of convenience. We simplify things. So let's go ahead and simplify this thing. So the built-in belief, which has that validity, men like and invest in beauty. Women like and invest in aesthetics. So thus, society, when looking toward women, are looking at the beauty, the outward appeal, right? Which there's a lot of like inward, outward, but like the overall beauty, right? How attractive is her? As this woman, this lady, in simple terms. With men, it's like the aesthetics, right? We'll say like they have money, or is there presentation like it's not that he's less attractive because he's shorter than other most people. It's like what that means, right? Is there being imposing, right? How much power, where where does his status lie, right? Um, Most people aren't going to be at the top, so that's so there's leg room for all these different places, but there's an aesthetic thing society looks at, um, so this is where you get things like heighdism, or this is where you get things like classism. That's mostly going to be directed at who is in charge of the household, which usually is, at least society sake, and the things have changed, but like with men, they're kind of stuck with this whole physically presentation. Does that mean something? Does looking at status, looking at if they're ambitious enough, how much have they gained, and it's a physical effort that they're looking at, and there is a physical presentation that's presented. I don't really want to get into this right now. I just want to scrape it, and I'm going to go back to it because I want to focus on porn addiction. But that goes in to it too, and the reason it goes into it because in the uphill battle of fighting against this addiction, there is a presentation issue, right? Um, on the one hand, being addicted to drugs could be something that we could be in favor of, in a sense, like just using your imagination. The idea that you are taking the substance and you are interested in this substance, and you're completely taken over by the substance, and the whole thing is like it's your choice and do what you want to do. And if in a world where you can just kind of accept people and their you know and that those things aren't going to destroy other people, you can go like, okay, well, whatever. You're not forced to or coerced to work for money. You're not, as a society, if we took care of ourselves in society, we may have less of an issue with people getting addicted to stuff. But then there's also the question of quality of life and all that kind of stuff. All this stuff kind of goes in. So I want to scrape this, but that goes into it because it gets into the whole build of a man, right? Because when we're talking about porn addiction, like a lot of this, in porn sexuality, notice that we're all kind of it's going to be directed mostly at men, as far as it's association. Um, it's funny that I using as a broad term, but a lot of this is associated with men. So we're going to get into that. But with the porn addiction aspect of it, it's interesting because with it being so much about men, the whole build of a man, the whole kind of the myth of the man. What is a man supposed to look like? Who is a man supposed to be? Is he supposed to be this hard-working, hierarchy um, runner-up, and he's failing because he's become content with an addiction. In this case, much like in other things, in earning status or capital, like money, that is the same when it comes to gaining a relationship. So instead of you gaining all this stuff, including relationship, you're just content with pornography, right? And I bring this up because porn addiction is also one of those terms that's used in different ways, right? You have the idea that you're addicted to this substance, like any kind of addiction, like addiction to alcohol or cigarette smoking, or you know, kind of level one drugs and stuff like that. But then there's this other aspect of porn addiction, which is the idea that you're kind of this sort of where you put your efforts into. Where is your, we'll say, time at, right? You're spending all this space with your favorite activity, doing your favorite thing. You're kind of wasting your life by doing something you enjoy that doesn't require hard work or whatever, right? Um, and so porn addiction gets applied there, right? A person is wasting their life just jerking off the porn or whatever, right? Not going out there and earning money and whatever, right? So there is this conflation of where it comes from. And again, in this uphill battle, the failure of it can be very can be very um you're it's like mercury, dude. It's like um I don't even know if I'm using the right metaphor, but in that uh you're both there's all these conflating ideas is what I'm saying. On the one hand, sexuality is inherently arousing, but then there's the battle of trying to earn all this stuff and all these expectations, and you're failing. And so when you're, there's this sort of, and again, in all this, there's this ugly societal um, sort of inherent distaste in sex, or at least this weird relationship with sex or sex adjacent stuff. Just erotica alone, society has this weird relationship with sex. And so there's a lot of guilt that you have in enjoying what should otherwise be a very normal and you know, especially if people who have high sex drives, which I expect a lot of people who claim to have porn addictions, and many of them probably have just high sex drives. Like have a lot of people have a lot of that they have certain tastes and certain ways about food. Which again, people will probably argue, well, they shouldn't just eat up the entire kitchen. Well, I mean, um, sure, but um, when it comes to sex, there's this inherent sort of historical purity thing that kind of goes into it. So it's a lot more. There's a lot of its own special complications with that, where we're still not accepting an inherent aspect of it. So to even get to that point where we can have those constructive sort of talks about when is it too much or whatever, right? I mean, a lot of it, porn addiction isn't even like you have a true addiction. A lot of the conversations that like, again, where's your time going? What are you doing? As opposed to doing what all of us are doing, how are you contributing to society kind of thing. That it just becomes a philosophy thing, right? And so you become like, people who just, and again, there, because of all these kind of conflations, it's like even though we're not really talking about the same thing, we all at least believe that we're talking about the same thing. And so the pleasure comes with a bit of a scar. You know, you are having this guilt, and so much of this addiction stuff. I mean, there is a prediction that a large portion of people who feel that they have an addiction also have a guilt, have this sort of opposition about sexual activity, masturbation, and media, watching media, um, and it just kind of spins out. So um, there's a kind of um, there's this kind of there's this self kind of um, depredation. I fucking can't even say words anymore. Self deprecation. And so while you feel great in its in in doing it, you're sexually aroused. You're like, I said I'm not gonna try to get into this whole thing, but it was calling me, so I got into it. And a lot of this story feels like what happens when someone is addicted to cocaine or addicted to other kind of level one kind of substances, or even just like drinking. And so that story is there, so it all seems to line up in your head. And so as you're sitting there and trying to fight against this machine, then you have the convenient thing, which is also this very natural thing, which is sexual activity with yourself or with others. And so you engage with it, unfortunately, in its lust. And again, being someone who is upholding this like cultural sort of sanction, you also have sex, which kind of breaks down a little bit of your sensibilities. So you're getting into more extreme stuff, where you're getting into things that are like seen as, because of the purity sort of culture. We're not supposed to be into this sort of thing, or we're not supposed to do this. Anal, right, kind of stuff. Feet, but if I'm addicted, then I must be into those stuff. Even though if you habituate, you're gonna look for things that's gonna get you sexual aroused, right, to reach that point, right? Again, the story seems to be in the way that you see addiction, which doesn't really have that much validity, but you know, the belief of it can be really strong. That those things kind of get muddled, but it goes into the whole porno sexuality thing, because we're talking about someone who is, in the way it's used, someone who is given in to their alleged addiction. So a lot of the direction seems to be either someone who just generally like, no, I mean, I prefer just looking at media as opposed to relationship, which means that I'm not engaging in the um, sort of effort to gain a relationship. No, I'm just saying, fuck it, I'm just gonna, it's liberating to just like do this thing, and I don't really have to care about some of these social relationships. And then the other is like, well, I'm going to kind of go into the fetish. So the fetish of, and again, in some facets, is embraces the fetish, and then there's people who genuinely believe that they have an issue. And so the word pornosexuality will be kind of an incidental word that will be in the kind of lexicon,